Every morning, the school bell rang. Children walked into their classrooms. They opened their books, and their teachers stood at the front of the room and began another day of lessons. To the children, it looked like an ordinary school day, but it wasn't, because behind that classroom door was a secret that was becoming impossible to hide. The people teaching Chicago's children weren't being paid, not for a few days, not for a few weeks, for months. By February 1933, Chicago's public school teachers were owed 8.5 months of back pay. Some had already gone deep into debt. Some struggled to buy food. Some faced the loss of their homes. And yet, every morning, they still showed up, because their students were waiting. This is the story of the Chicago teachers who taught through one of the worst financial crises in American history, until eventually, they had enough. Then came the paper. Scrip. It looked like money. It had value written on it. It represented wages the teachers had earned. But there was a problem. You couldn't always use it like cash. Some businesses refused to accept it. Others accepted it only at a discount. And some lenders were willing to give teachers cash for their scrip, but at brutal interest rates. Imagine going to work every day, doing your job, teaching children, and receiving a piece of paper instead of a paycheck. Then walking into a grocery store and hearing, "Sorry, we don't accept that." The humiliation wasn't just financial, it was personal. Teachers were respected members of their communities. People trusted them with their children. But now some of those same teachers couldn't reliably buy groceries. Contemporary reporting described teachers in desperate poverty, with some borrowing against scrip at extremely high interest rates. Time. And the cruelest part, the children sitting in their classrooms were suffering too. Some students came from families so poor that they arrived at school hungry. The teachers were struggling to feed themselves while trying to teach hungry children. Think about what that means. Imagine being a teacher in Chicago in 1933. You haven't been properly paid in months. Your bills are piling up. Your savings are gone. Maybe your landlord is waiting. Maybe the grocery store won't take your scrip. Maybe you've borrowed money from someone who is charging you more interest than you can ever afford. And yet, tomorrow morning, you still have to go to school because your students are waiting. You walk into the classroom. You pick up the chalk. You write on the blackboard. You teach mathematics. You teach history. You teach reading. And you pretend everything is normal. But outside that classroom, your own life is falling apart. This was the extraordinary contradiction facing Chicago's teachers. They were expected to prepare the next generation for the future, while they themselves couldn't afford the present. But eventually, the teachers stopped waiting quietly. In April 1933, anger spilled into the streets. Thousands of teachers and supporters took part in protests across Chicago. And on April 24, approximately 5,000 teachers marched to confront the banks that held city funds, but refused to honor their scrip. One of the men at the center of the movement was John N. Fuchs. He was a physical education teacher and coach, but by this point, he had become something more, a leader. The teachers were no longer asking politely, they were demanding their money. Money they had already earned, money they had worked for, money that represented months of their lives. The protest became increasingly confrontational. Teachers entered bank buildings, windows were broken, furniture was overturned, police were called, and the anger that had been building for years finally exploded into the open. This was no longer just a dispute over pay, it had become a battle over dignity. For years, the crisis had been happening quietly, inside classrooms, inside kitchens, inside homes. But now, everyone could see it. Chicago's teachers were on the streets. Newspapers across the country reported on the unrest. And suddenly, the question was no longer, how long can the teachers wait? The question became, how can a city allow its teachers to go unpaid for so long? The teachers had spent years telling children that problems could be solved with patience. But patience had a limit. And in the spring of 1933, that limit had been reached. The classroom had become the protest line. The school book had become a symbol of frustration, and the teacher who once stood quietly at a blackboard was now standing in the middle of Chicago's financial crisis. But the story didn't end in the streets. The crisis eventually forced a larger solution. Chicago's financial problems became so severe that the federal government became involved. In 1934, A $22.5 million loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation helped clear the way for Chicago teachers and other school employees to finally receive the money they had been waiting for. After years of uncertainty, the paychecks finally came. The numbers were enormous, but behind every paycheck was a person, a teacher who could finally pay a bill, a family that could finally buy food, a home that might finally be saved. And perhaps the most powerful thing about this story is what happened while all of this was going on. The teachers kept teaching, even when they weren't being paid. Even when their own lives were falling apart, they still showed up. They still opened their books. They still stood in front of their students, because the children didn't cause the crisis, and the children still needed someone to teach them. So when you look back at the Great Depression, don't only remember the breadlines, remember the classrooms, remember the teachers who went months without pay, remember the people who were expected to educate the future while struggling to survive the present. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories of history aren't about the people who made the decisions. They're about the ordinary people who had to live with them. And in Chicago, those people were teachers. They had been patient, they had been silent, and eventually, they stood up. Because even teachers have to eat.